This is ultimately a simple, empirical exploration of your own experience. The first and sometimes most challenging aspect of this is to learn to investigate experience beyond thought, or learn to investigate experience that is not attributable to thought. And just realizing what that means can take years, actually. So it's helpful to point out what I mean by this as an entry point, but I'll also say that anyone interested in this can take a look at my playlist called Mind Identification, and also Fixations and Obstructions, or Obstructions and Fixations. I can't remember what I titled it, but it's another playlist that talks about these types of issues, but specifically the Mind Identification playlist. So the way we do this is through inquiry. I'll ask the question and you look for the answer. Here we go. So if I ask you this, who are you? What do you reference? Take a moment to see where your attention goes. Who are you? Now, merely observing where your attention moves, merely observing what occurs in your experience can be valuable here. What is referenced? Is there a gap? What I mean by that is many people will start to engage thoughts about who they are. You may think about your age, your name, your origin, your parents. You may think about your qualities, where you live, what you do for work, who is important to you, what your roles are. So this is pretty common that we'll reference all of that, and that is thought. But the question of is there a gap means that when I ask the question, who are you? Are those thoughts immediate, or is there a gap? Is there a bit of a pause, just a moment of wonder or curiosity or contentlessness, and then the thoughts begin? Or are the thoughts just immediately there? Let's start over. Who are you? Now, again, all we're really doing at this point is we're looking at where the attention goes when I ask the question and you consider it. Did you recognize a gap? Now, I understand thoughts may start thinking about the gap as well. Thoughts may start saying, oh, I don't know if there was a gap. Was there a gap? I think there was a gap, right? But before that, before those thoughts started thinking about analyzing, nominalizing, was there an actual gap where there weren't thoughts? Let's try again. Who are you? If there was a gap, did it get longer? Was it a fraction of a second? Was it a few seconds? Was it the entire pause before I started speaking again? Let's try again. Who are you? Now, before we proceed, I want to point out one very, very simple thing here. If you're experiencing a gap, not thinking about a gap, but actually experiencing a thoughtless moment, that's enough. You don't even really have to watch the rest of this video. You don't have to watch any other videos at all. If that's clear to you and it's interesting, then go sit with it. Ask yourself the question, and then lead yourself to the gap and stay in the gap. Notice as you stay in the gap that you can do it longer. Practice this. Do it with a relaxed body. Don't strain or push or apply tension, but continue and see what happens. See if that gap clarifies, deepens, seems to last longer, or even seems to go beyond time. This is good practice. This whole awakening business is not complicated. It's really about simple openings, simple explorations, and finding what works for you. And when you find what works for you, don't overlook it. Don't go, oh, I want to think about this more. Let me write about it. Let me tell my friends about it. No. Do it again. If you want to wake up and keep waking up. That's the point. Find the simple opening that works for you and jump into that gap. And come what may, stay there. So again, if you really perceive what I'm talking about here, this gap, that is enough practice. That can lead you beyond Kensho, beyond a shift in identity. So who are you? So some of the viewers will not experience a gap here, or maybe they will, but they won't perceive it initially. That's okay. It doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It doesn't mean this can't work for you. It doesn't mean you can't wake up. It just means your mind is active. In fact, it could just be the time of day. Perhaps if you did this right before you went off to sleep, it would be different. Perhaps if you do it right when you wake up, it would be different. Perhaps if you did it right as you were finishing an exercise, physical exercise, it would be different. Or if you just try a few different times over the next few days or a week, you may, one of those times, notice a gap. So if this is interesting to you, but you're not really getting what I mean by a gap, like thoughts are just seeming to be continuous, that's okay. Give yourself space to work with this, to try it. And all you need is a little gap. Once you recognize it, you can lead yourself back to it. So that's going to be a subsegment of people who watch this. Other people who watch this, they're going to ask the question, and everything is a gap. There's very obviously no answer. It leads to just a sort of brilliant presence. That's great. At that stage of things, this type of practice isn't really that helpful. It may be, but you may be more well-served by working with non-dual contemplations or investigating the nature of presence itself, or working with reactivity or other things. But again, whatever feels right for you, go for it. This practice is usually oriented toward giving someone that initial insight, which is a fundamental transformation in identity, the experience of who you are, awakening. Now, for those people who feel that there's just no gap at all, that there's just thought after thought after thought, and listening to me is just sort of changing the flavor of thoughts and the content for a moment, and then the thoughts go back to the usual habitual thoughts and on and on and on and on, right? Like, I know that world. I used to live in it, and I found it extremely uncomfortable. I think many people do. If that's the case, and what I'm talking about here just sounds like more of the same. It sounds like more thoughts, more concepts, more beliefs, more some nonsense someone's trying to sell you or tell you or whatever. If that's how you're experiencing this, that's fine too. Totally fine. Right? I would just ask you this. Who are you that is completely unchanged no matter what those thoughts are saying? Meaning, there can be a continuous wall of thoughts. Thoughts about this, thoughts about that, thoughts about mom, thoughts about dad, thoughts about brother, sister, parents, lover, work, politics, health, like just on and on, entertainment, on and on and on and on and on, right? The thoughts just go and go and go. So these thoughts can just seem continuous, but the subject of the thoughts change all the time. Sometimes they're thinking about people, sometimes they're thinking about yourself, sometimes they're thinking about situations, sometimes they're daydreaming, sometimes they're fantasizing. But with all of that change and flux, with all of that dynamism of thought content, have you noticed that there's something that doesn't change at all? Your sense of the one that's the thinker, or your sense of the one that's aware of the thoughts. Have you noticed it doesn't change? Isn't that interesting? The thoughts can be there. You don't have to stop the thoughts, and you don't have to find a gap. Just become interested in what it is that actually doesn't change no matter what those thoughts are saying. So for instance, I could say, who are you? And a thought could say, oh, I'm George, and I was born in Michigan in 1984 and whatever, right? So that thought is sort of answering the question of who you are, seemingly. It's defining you. But who your experience of what your experience of yourself right now hasn't changed since the question was asked. Meaning, the experience of you was the same before I asked the question. It's not like you suddenly became you when you started engaging the thought that says your name is George and you came from this place and this time. Does that make sense? So the sense of you, regardless of how it seems to be being colored by thought in the moment, is unchanging. Isn't that interesting? So then that's why I could say, hey, those thoughts that say you're this person from this time and place, sure, those facts seem to be true because they seem to be a memory that seems to have happened. And yet, if that thought and memory aren't there, you don't stop being you. Your experience of the thinker is still there. Your experience of the observer is still there. Your experience of the experiencer is still there. So that's where the money is. That's what I'm pointing to all the time, that you can actually drop right into the experience of you, not contingent upon thoughts. The thoughts can still be there. There doesn't have to be a gap, but you can actually directly experience the sense of you in a way that you've overlooked for a long time because you've been sort of buying into those thoughts. You've been overly focusing on the thoughts. You've been holding the thought at a distance and analyzing the thoughts and believing the thoughts and rejecting the thoughts and pulling some thoughts closer, right? Managing the thoughts. So you're so busy with the management of thoughts that your attention's out there in the thoughts. All I'm saying is you can actually pull your attention back in for 1 second and realize your attention's never actually been outside of this. That's the other strange thing. It's kind of like a crystal or like a prism that transmits light, right? You could shine white light on a prism. It separates the light into multiple colors. You could say that's like you. Consciousness moves through you and separates seemingly into a bunch of different kinds of thoughts and experiences. But the prism itself is unchanged by that. The light can be on or off. The prism's still the prism. It's not actually changed by anything that moves through it or anything that it projects out onto a screen, right? You're that. That's what I'm pointing to. I'm pointing to you are whatever it is. I'm not going to call it something, the vessel for that experience. The vessel for the experience of you. What is the experience of you right now? Go to it. Or realize you can't go to it because you're already there. They're both the same thing. That's all I'm ever pointing to. And that's the same as the gap, really. In fact, the second way I'm talking about this can be a more radical transformation because with the gap, it's like you can kind of sense what's happening and it can build maybe, and you can get more of a sense of where to go and directional sort of intuition. With this, it's more like sometimes a sudden backward step of like, holy shit, how did I overlook this? How in the world? I can't overlook it. I can't overlook it at all. It's impossible. So how did I overlook it? I don't know. It's really funny, right? All of a sudden, everything seems so different. So don't fret if you have endless thoughts, an endless wall of thoughts. This can still shift for sure. It does. It did for me. And that's it. So you don't even really have to ask, who am I? But it's more like, what does it feel like to be you right now? How is it to perceive the perceiver? How is it to be conscious of the consciousness itself? And only the consciousness, regardless of what it seems to be conscious of. Whether it's a thought about this, that, present, past, future, problem, solution, doesn't matter. Consciousness is just conscious. Awareness is just aware. Being is just being. Don't worry about these words, whether they mean something spiritual or not. I'm using the words to point back to your immediate experience, which is more real than those words. Your experience is more real than the words I'm using. That's it. Yeah. And that's what I'm pointing to. So get curious about that. Get curious about how you could possibly overlook that which can't be overlooked. How can you miss that which can't be missed? Yeah. It's really bizarre, actually, when you start to get a taste of that. So meditate on that. Sit with it. Become curious about it. Don't settle for another thought. Don't settle for another thought. They're hypnotic, but don't settle for another thought about you. Don't settle for anything but the most obvious, primary, clear experience of your true nature, what you actually are right now, regardless of thoughts.